We left off here on page 321 of the lecture notes, and we are talking about the Crusades. At this point in our trek through the Middle Ages, and you'll remember we've been kind of going back and forth between the West and the East, and talking a little bit about the rise of the papacy in the West, meanwhile talking about the kind of slow decline of the Eastern Byzantine Empire in the East, and a lot of that is due to the rise of Islam in the East. And as we come now into this second period of 500 years within the Middle Ages, what we call the High Middle Ages or the Late Middle Ages, we see that these tensions between Christianity and Islam reach a fevered pitch to the point where Christians in the West take up arms to fight the Muslims, really for two reasons. One is to defend the Christians of the East against Muslim attack, but more than that, it's because they want to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. And Jerusalem, as we mentioned, was conquered by Muslim armies in 637. So in the early part of the 7th century already, Jerusalem fell into Muslim hands. It had remained in Muslim hands ever since. And here we are 400 years later, a little more, 450 years later, and Christians in Western Europe are making it their aim to reconquer that which was lost. We call this period of time, we call these battles the Crusades. As we mentioned on Tuesday, it's a little bit of an anachronistic term. That's probably the best way to say it, meaning that it's not a term that the people who were alive during this period used to describe these military ventures, but they did talk about going and fighting in the sign of the cross or under the banner of the cross. And so the word cross, crusa, is where we get the word crusade. So these are military expeditions that were fought for the honor of Christ and for the glory of the cross. And as we talked about on Tuesday, this was Christianity's version of holy war. Islam had invented the holy war back in the 7th century when Muhammad started to attack his opponents, but now Christians essentially adopt the idea of holy war. The Pope promises that anyone who dies in these holy wars will go straight to heaven. At a time when most people believed in purgatory, going straight to heaven was considered somewhat of a, get out of purgatory free card. You could bypass all of that temporal suffering in the afterlife and go straight to celestial glory. So there were a lot of people in Western Europe who, when the Pope began to preach crusade, got excited about going and defending the honor of Christ, going and recapturing that which had been lost to Muslim hands. There had been, throughout this entire period, there had been many Western Christians who had taken pilgrimages to the Holy Land. That was something that was considered spiritual, to go and take a pilgrimage at some time in your life to the sites of the Holy Land. Many of the churches that are still there in Jerusalem, built on holy sites, had been built all the way back during the time of Constantine. Constantine's mother had gone around and raised money to build some of those ancient church buildings. And so Christians would go and visit these sites, and it was a great mark of dedication as a Christian to have taken a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. For a long time, the Muslim rulers of that area allowed Christian pilgrims to come and visit those holy sites. But in 1076, a new regime began to began to prohibit Christian pilgrims from coming to Jerusalem, and actually began to ambush Christian pilgrims as they traveled to Jerusalem. And this was just another straw on the camel's back, I suppose. Eventually, that breaks the camel's back, and that leads the Western Christians to declare war on their Muslim enemies. Now, the actual historical context, the real spark that ignited this 200-year period of Crusades came in 1095. The Seljuk Turks, a Muslim group, started to threaten the security of Constantinople. Constantinople is a city that is known by several names. In the medieval period, we often refer to it as Byzantium, but Constantinople was its old Roman name when Constantine had moved the capital city of Rome to the east. After the Muslim conquest of Byzantium, the name will be changed again to Istanbul, which is what we call the city today. The Seljuk Turks began to threaten the security of the Byzantine Empire and of Constantinople itself, and so out of desperation, the emperor of Constantinople, a man named Alexius, he sent for help from Christian soldiers in the west. Now, this is 40 years after the split between the East and West, so you can see how desperate things had gotten in the East for the East to humble itself and ask for help from the West just 40 years after they had formally separated from one another. Alexius appeals to not a king or an emperor in Europe, but he appeals to the Pope. And I think that's an interesting insight into the elevated status that the Pope had during this period, that the emperor of the East would appeal to essentially his equal in the West. Well, who is his equal in the West? It's the Pope. The Pope is the one who can pull this off. No king in Europe has the power to be able to pull off this kind of unified response. The Oxford History of Islam says this about the context. It says many complex factors went into the call of Pope Urban II, that's the name of the Pope who responded to Alexius's call, for a crusade against the Muslims who since 638 had occupied Jerusalem. For more than 4 centuries, Christians had been allowed to practice their religion freely in that city. In 1076, however, Jerusalem was taken by the Seljuk Turks, who were said to have desecrated the holy places of Christianity and treated the Christian population with brutality. Pilgrims returning from Jerusalem brought sad news of their fellow Christians there. Although the notion of avenging these wrongs and regaining the holy city for Christianity had been seeping into Western consciousness for some time, it was not until the preaching of such monks as Peter the Hermit that popular opinion began to rise in support of such an effort. Encouraged by an appeal for assistance from Emperor Alexius I of Constantinople, Urban II promised his help and sent out the call for the First Crusade. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, the Pope was greeted with great enthusiasm when he called for an international crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the infidels. So here we have then the beginnings of this crusading period. I've got a chart there that shows you the 7 crusades. Now there's a little bit later in the notes where we actually have 9 crusades listed, and that's because historians sometimes split some of these crusades in half and come up with a total of 9 rather than 7. Probably 7 is the most accurate number. It's the number that has the widest consensus among scholars, but I don't want you to be confused when you see 9 a little bit later in the notes. The reality is that some of these crusades were not as organized as others, and so they represent kind of large, sweeping military action on the part of various individuals and leaders in Europe. It's not quite as neat and tidy as sometimes we would want it to be. Rome answers then in the First Crusade. Pope Urban initiates a church council and preaches a sermon in which he calls on Frankish knights to vow to march to the east with the twin aims of freeing Christians from the yoke of Islamic rule and liberating the tomb of Christ, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, from Muslim control. So this is, again, a crusade that's being fought for the honor of Christ. How could Christians have allowed the Holy Land to fall into the hands of the infidels? We need to go and recapture it for the glory of Christ and the glory of his kingdom. That was the thinking that motivated the Crusades. When we think about the Crusades, and I'm just going to back up here for a second. When we think about the Crusades really take place in three different stages. So if we want to simplify things a little bit, when we think about this 200-year period of time, from 1095 when the First Crusade is initiated to 1291 when the last Crusader stronghold finally falls back into Muslim hands, that 200-year period of time really fits into three different sections. The first 50 years is a time of victory and success for the Crusaders. The next 50 years is a time of loss and defeat for the Crusaders. And then the last 100 years is kind of this dwindling period where people are still hanging on and nobody really knows what's going on, and the Crusades eventually collapse as a dismal and lingering defeat and blight on European history. In some ways, to make kind of a modern comparison, I think the Crusades mirror what happened in the Vietnam War. There was that initial success for American soldiers, then there was a period of defeat, and then there was a period where everyone was kind of hanging around and nobody was really sure what was going on, and it ended up being kind of a dismal failure. That's what happens with the Crusades. Success, followed by defeat, followed by this lingering period of just kind of slowly being beaten back and finally being completely removed out of the Middle East by the Muslim forces. So the First Crusade is this successful crusade. In many ways, it's the only successful crusade. And when I use the word successful, I don't mean successful in a spiritual sense. What I mean is it was successful militarily. It was there were many atrocities that took place, and not something that we would champion, but successful in the sense that it was able to temporarily retake certain parts of the Holy Land. Urban II was not the only one who began to preach crusade. For this First Crusade, there were others. I have some listed here: Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless. Some of you in seminary probably feel like Walter the Penniless. But in any case, these were lay preachers who preached the crusade to the common people. Peter the Hermit, Walter the Penniless, and others. As a result of their preaching, there were many of the peasants who got excited about going on a crusade as well. And this First Crusade then leaves from Europe in two waves. There is the Peasants Crusade, and then there is the Princes Crusade. The Peasants Crusade is about 20,000 peasants, poor peasants, who had nothing better to do than to leave and go off on an adventure where, again, the worst thing that could happen is they would die and go straight to heaven. So 20,000 untrained farmers, through the preaching of Peter and Walter, get excited about crusade and march down to Byzantium, to Constantinople, and suddenly Alexius I, who has asked the West for some highly trained military personnel to buttress his armies against the Muslims, finds his city inundated with 20,000 beggars, essentially, who show up saying, hey, we want to fight. And Alexius, I think, got more than he bargained for when that first Peasants Crusade showed up. He essentially sent them down to face the Muslims, and they got completely wiped out. So that initial wave of untrained farmers going to fight against the Muslim armies was disastrous for those involved. But it was shortly after that Alexius did get the help that he was looking for. The Princes Crusade, which is what Urban II was really calling for, was led by a number of lords, and it involved knights and trained soldiers. One of the advantages of the crusade for those in Europe was that the infighting between all these different tribal groups, between the burgeoning nations of France and Germany and England, the infighting suddenly got redirected. When you've got siblings who are always fighting at one another, you suddenly give them a common enemy to fight and they become the best of friends. Well, that's what happens in Europe, is we have the infighting within Europe more or less come to a standstill, not completely, but the common enemy of Islam gives the Europeans someone to fight other than each other. When the second wave of Crusaders arrives in Constantinople, they then travel from there down to fight some of these battles, and I have some of the battles listed here. So they retake the city of Nicaea, and of course Nicaea was more or less a suburb of Constantinople, so you can see how close the Muslim armies are to the city of Constantinople, that the Crusaders start by taking back the city of Nicaea. They then go down and take the city of Antioch, which is a major battle, a siege that lasts for almost an entire year. And it's only because there's a traitor in the Muslim armies that essentially leaves his post unattended, and the Crusaders are able to come in and capture the city. The entire crusading period is characterized by a lot of superstition, and when we think about Roman Catholic superstition, it reaches something of an apex during this second half of the Middle Ages, and we see some of that in the Crusades. A lot of the Crusaders, of course, they're praying to Mary and the saints for protection in their battles, but in some of these cities, as places in the Holy Land are recovered, suddenly people claim that the things that they've discovered there are actually artifacts from the time of Christ. And these artifacts get taken back to Europe, and they suddenly become very valuable. So there's an incentive to find things that may or may not have been artifacts belonging to the person and work of Christ. One of those artifacts that came from this battle in Antioch was the lance, the Holy Lance. And a guy named Peter Bartholomew supposedly had a vision where St. Andrew appeared to him and told him where the lance, the spear that had pierced Jesus' side, would be discovered, and they went and looked, and there it was. And so this Holy Lance encouraged all of the soldiers to keep fighting. So you can get a little bit of an insight into the mentality of some of these soldiers, that so much of their enthusiasm is sparked and guided by superstition. It also, I think, calls into question a lot of the relics and artifacts that are part of Roman Catholic lore and tradition today. Many of those things were quote-unquote discovered during the Crusading period. Well, that's 1,100 years after the time of Christ. It's highly unlikely that the spear that pierced Christ's side was sitting under, some rocks in Antioch for the better part of a millennium. But this, of course, is also where all of the tradition and folklore about the Holy Grail and the Knights Templar and all of that other stuff comes from. Yep, Daniel.
Was this group kind of ignoring what happened at the Second Council of Nicaea and just running off with whatever they found?
What do you mean in terms of ignoring what happened? In terms of icons and such?
Icon worship, especially now that they're holding relics as almost items of worship.
Yeah, well, the Second Council of Nicaea had said that was okay. So the Second Council of Nicaea actually permits the veneration of icons. So relics, icons, all of that stuff within Roman Catholic history becomes very much a part of the superstitious, mystical religion that Catholicism becomes.
This would be considered one of those feasts.
Yeah, I think so. I think they're, at least the Second Council of Nicaea, maybe I should say it this way, the Second Council of Nicaea only confirmed and perpetuated the enthusiasm for relics like this. And, again, when an army is looking for divine confirmation that what they're doing is right, a vision that leads to an ancient relic like the spear that pierced Christ's side, that was considered an amazing, a miraculous find. There couldn't be greater confirmation that what we were doing is right. All right, eventually, the Crusaders made their way down to the city of Jerusalem, and it only took about a month in the year 1099 for the Crusaders to conquer Jerusalem. And I think it's important for us to realize that when we think about the Crusades in general, the Crusades did not have as their objective the conversion of Muslims. The Crusades had as their only objective the conquest and annihilation of Muslims. There was also, as a byproduct of this, the conquest and annihilation of many Jews. So Jews and Muslims were both targeted by Crusaders, and more often than not, they were killed and not converted, because this was not about missions, this was about domination. So when we get to the battle for Jerusalem, we can read about some of the destruction that took place and helps with the context. Yes, David?
I mean, how would they, I know you weren't there, how would they respond to, we should try to convert these people? I mean, wouldn't they say, hey, let's convert them instead of killing them, kind of mentality, or they just thought that's not going to happen?
I think it was more that they adopted, essentially, even the Muslim mentality of holy war. I mean, these were holy wars, and the idea is that the infidel needs to be killed. And so for the Christians, the Muslims were the infidels. And, it seems maybe strange to us today to think that, to recognize that Christians for a time period adopted that sort of mentality, because we associated it so much with what we call radical Islam. But the Crusades, their mentality was, domination. That we are here to conquer and to kill. With regard to the Jews, you have kind of that development of anti-Semitism, theological anti-Semitism initially, but it boils over into just full-blown anti-Semitism that does creep up during this time period. The Jews were considered the killers of Christ, and so subsequent generations of Jewish people are made to suffer on account of what took place in the Gospels. And of course, all of this does a great deal to strain relationships between Christians and Jews, still to this day, and of course between Christians and Muslims, still to this day. Yep, Jim.
So how big is the Muslim troop? Wherein the 20,000 commoner, like farmers, that they wipe out easily. So I was thinking, are they really hunter like Esau and something like that?
Yeah, how many troops are we talking about here in some of these battles? I don't know the specific numbers for all of the battles. I know when we get to the Third Crusade that we have a European army coming down from the Holy Roman Empire that numbers around 100,000. And that's in addition then to both an English army and a French army that were probably in the tens of thousands. So we're looking at potential battles with, tens of thousands and in some cases hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And of course it's all hand-to-hand combat and archery. It's that kind of warfare.
So they have the means to build up those kind of armies and also equipments. They have the money for the Muslim part.
Yeah, both sides are armed. In the case of the peasant army that went down in the First Crusade, it was not only that they were unarmed. I'm sure they had some implements of some sort. Maybe some people had been able to get a sword here or there, or they took with them some sort of farming implement that they could use as a weapon. It was more the fact that they were completely untrained. So it was just 20,000 excited peasant volunteers who said, yeah, let's go fight. And they ran off like a mob, and they got destroyed by well-trained soldiers who were ready for them. It's not until the European soldiers come that the First Crusade begins to have success from a military standpoint. All right, so on June 9th, 1099, we begin a siege then of Jerusalem, and by July 15th of that same year, Jerusalem is conquered. So just over a millennia ago, the Crusaders reconquer the city of Jerusalem. So here we have an account. This is from a Crusader. Then our men held a council and gave out that everyone should give alms and pray that God would choose whom he wished to reign over the others and rule the city. They further gave orders that all the dead Saracens, that's the Muslims, should be cast out on account of the terrible stench, because nearly the whole city was crammed with their bodies. The Saracens who were still alive dragged the dead ones out in front of the gates and made huge piles of them as big as houses. Such a slaughter of pagans no one has ever seen or heard of. The pyres, or the piles they made, were like pyramids. So there you get, I think, a sense of the violent destruction that took place, again, in the name of Christ and under the banner of the cross. Yep.
Which group was the untrained group? Was more untrained?
The untrained group was the 20,000 or so farmers who came down, and they're mentioned up here on page 324. And right here, that there was this initial group of peasants who came down and fought and were either killed in battle or were taken as slaves as a result of their well-intentioned but poorly conceived military venture. It wasn't until the knights and soldiers of Europe showed up that there was actually a real challenge to the Muslim control of that territory. Okay, back down here, you can see the routes that were taken by some of these crusaders. And probably the foremost of these is the guy whose troops are represented in blue, Godfrey of Bouillon. And but you have some others, Raymond of Toulouse, Robert of Flanders, and so on. And these crusading armies, led by knights, came down, and you can see they started at Constantinople, then they traveled a short distance to Nicaea, conquered Nicaea, then down to Edessa and Antioch, and finally to Jerusalem. As a result of their success, we have a number of Crusader kingdoms that are established. And I think I have a, well, I guess I don't on this one. You can see them here in this map. There's another map that I have in a different place, but these Crusader kingdoms, you can see down here in the blue, right around the Holy Land, that the Crusader kingdoms recover most of modern-day Israel, Lebanon, parts of modern-day Syria, and even parts of southern Turkey are now recovered by these Crusaders. And for a short period of time, we're going to have these Crusader kingdoms that control the Middle East. So that little area there is made bigger over here in the map on the top left, and you can see that you have the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader kingdom of Tripoli, the Crusader kingdom of Antioch, Crusader kingdom of Edessa, and the Crusader kingdom of southern Armenia. And so we have these kingdoms now that are established. And Godfrey of Bouillon, for example, is the one who's put in charge of Jerusalem after his troops successfully conquer it in 1099. For about 50 years then, Christian soldiers control Jerusalem, and we have this period of time now where pilgrims are once again granted free access from Western Europe to go and visit Jerusalem, to visit the holy sites there in the Holy Land. We have a couple orders of knights, which we'll talk about in more detail, but we have a couple orders of knights that are established as well. These are now warrior monks. These are monastic orders that now fight, and the reason they are created is to protect pilgrims as they travel down to Jerusalem and to maintain these Crusader states. So we have the Knights Templar, or the Knights of Solomon's Temple, because their headquarters was supposedly where Solomon's Temple once stood. So we have the Knights Templar. They're the ones that are always involved in all of the Holy Grail legends, and including the Da Vinci Code. And then we also have the Hospitallers, or the Knights of St. John, which are another group, and they're called the Hospitallers because part of what they did was establish hospitals along the way as well. So we have these routes, and the Knights Templar in particular are interesting. Part of the reason there's so much legend that's grown up around them is because they became a very wealthy order, and it wasn't so much because they discovered these ancient relics. They didn't discover the lost cup of Christ or anything like that. Sorry to ruin the movie for you, but what they did was they established a banking system in Europe where they allowed pilgrims to deposit money in Europe, travel to the Holy Land, and then they could make withdrawals from those accounts in Jerusalem when they got there. So kind of an early ATM system established by the Knights Templar, and of course they're able to collect interest off of all of this, and it made them a very wealthy order. So a lot of folklore and legends arise about these groups because they suddenly become wealthy, and people assume that there's some sort of conspiracy theory that explains where the wealth comes from. More likely it was just good business sense. If you want alternate theories, I'm sure Dr. Farnell would be happy to offer some for you. So we have that period of success then for the First Crusade, this 50 years or so where we have conquered these areas in the Middle East, and so Europe sees this as a great boon for Christianity. Well, things start to take a turn for the worse starting in the late 1140s, so just about 50 years after the conquest of Jerusalem. First Crusade had been a war that was victorious against all odds. This only confirmed in the minds of Westerners that this was indeed a holy war which God himself was commending. After the First Crusade, the Muslims struck back by taking Edessa. So Edessa is the first of these Crusader kingdoms to fall. And the Second Crusade then is launched to try and push back the Muslim assault on these Christian lands. And this time it's not just knights and lords who are involved, but actually kings. So we have Conrad III of Germany and Louis VII of France. And together then we have really the two halves of the old Frankish kingdom, the troops of the Holy Roman Empire, the troops of France coming down to fight against the Muslims. Unfortunately, things did not go well. And when they came, eventually they came all the way down to Jerusalem and decided to attack Edessa from the south to go up through Damascus and eventually up to Edessa. It didn't work out though. When they got to Damascus, they had to withdraw. And I have a quote in here from a Muslim eyewitness who talks about how the Franks were soundly defeated, and of course the Muslims took that as a sign of God's judgment on the Christians. A few years later, we have then the Third Crusade, which is still in the second 50 years of defeat and failure. There's a Muslim leader who comes to power whose name is Saladin, and some of you have probably heard the name Saladin. He rises to power quickly and gains notoriety and fame on the battlefield because he really is the one who overturns these Crusader kingdoms and pushes the Christians out of the Holy Land. The Third Crusade has the most famous participants. You probably never heard of Conrad III or Louis VII, but you've almost certainly heard of King Richard the Lionhearted, and you probably have also heard of Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. So Saladin is the Muslim leader, Frederick is the king of the Holy Roman Empire, Richard, the Lionheart of Robin Hood fame, which, sorry to burst any of your bubbles, but Robin Hood actually didn't live during the time of Richard. That's a myth, and there probably wasn't actually a guy named Robin Hood, but in any case. And Philip Augustus, king of France. And so we have these three European kings who travel down to fight against these Islamic attacks. Along the way, as they were traveling down, Frederick, the king of the Holy Roman Empire, who had that army of 100,000 men, dies in a freak accident while trying to cross the river. So he was halfway across a river and got stuck and drowned before his knights could get to him. And so his armies were greatly discouraged. And some historians think that maybe the Third Crusade was lost before it even started because of the lack of morale among those troops of the Holy Roman Empire. So we have some battles then between Saladin and these men, and the net result, as you can see from this map, is that by 1190, so less than 100 years after Jerusalem was conquered, pretty much everything has been lost. Jerusalem is lost, Hattin is lost, Acre is lost, Damascus was already lost, Edessa was already lost, and the county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch are greatly reduced in size. Really the only Crusader kingdom of any substance that's left is that of southern Armenia, or Armenian Cilicia. Christopher Tylerman here talks about the fact that there was another relic that was lost during this time, and the soldiers were again demoralized because of the loss of the relic. I mentioned some of these military orders already. We have the Templars, who we've already talked about. One name that I need to mention in connection with both the Templars and the Second Crusade is a name that's probably familiar to you in church history, the name of Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux writes some things of a devotional nature that many Christians find to be encouraging. Even John Calvin mentions Bernard in a positive light. Now, there certainly was some Catholicism that was seeping into his thinking, and yet you can read some of Bernard's stuff and I think be encouraged. On the flip side, Bernard was also a major proponent of the Crusades. And in the same way that Urban II, Walter the Penniless, Peter the Hermit were the preachers of the First Crusade, Bernard of Clairvaux was the primary advocate of the Second Crusade. And along with it, one of the founding advocates, I suppose I could say it that way, one of the founding advocates of the Knights Templar, or the Knights of the Temple. And he said this about the Knights Templar. He said, first of all, this is describing what these warrior monks are supposed to be like. First of all, there is discipline and unqualified obedience. Everybody comes and goes according to the will of the commander. Everybody wears the dress given to him, and no one goes in search for food or garments according to his whims. They live in a community, soberly and in joy, without wife or children. And to each evangelical perfection they live in the same house, in the same manner, without calling anything their own, solicitous to preserve the unity of spirit in the bond of peace. So he's talking about the order with which and discipline with which they live their lives as monks. Impudent words, senseless occupations, immoderate laughter, whispering, or even suppressed giggling are unknown. So these are manly men. They don't sit around as busybodies. They have a horror of chess and dice, so they don't play games like chess. They hate hunting. They don't even enjoy the flight of the falcon. They don't have time for that kind of stuff. They despise mimes, jugglers, storytellers, dirty songs, performances of buffoons. All these they regard as vanities and inane follies. They cut their hair short because they know it is shameful for a man to wear it long. Never overdressed, they bathe rarely and are dirty and hirsute, I don't even know what that word means, tanned by the coat of mail and the sun. So these guys, they live an orderly and disciplined life. They don't have time for frivolous things, and they don't have time to mess around because they're very serious about what it means to protect the pilgrims and to protect the holy sites. Really? All right. They are rarely dirty or hairy. These knights took an oath by which they pledged that they would fight to the death for the holy places of Christendom, that they would refuse to be ransomed if defeated, that they must accept every combat regardless of the odds, that they would refuse quarter or ransom to the infidels. So if you find somebody of the opposition, you are to take their life, and that they must defend any Christian who would be bothered or assaulted by the enemy. And this was their pledge. So they're sort of the SEAL teams of the crusading period. They certainly gain that reputation of being, I think, the elite troops that represent Christianity during this time. The Hospitallers become kind of the rival group. So these are the Army Rangers, and have kind of a rivalry with the Knights Templar. And as I mentioned, built a network of hospitals throughout the Holy Land. Eventually, these two groups go into decline, but what's interesting about them is the fact that they represent a new mentality among Christians. For the first time in church history, we have monks who are also soldiers. There's one third group, the Teutonic Knights, also started around this time in 1199 as an official military order. The Teutonic Knights are mostly involved in a different set of crusades, the Crusades to the north. And it's kind of interesting, when we talk about crusades, we always think about the Crusades down to the Middle East, but there were also crusades still in Spain to push the Muslims out of Spain, and there were crusades to the north to conquer the remaining pagan tribal groups that lived up in Denmark and Finland and Sweden and Norway and those parts of Europe. We don't usually hear about those crusades, and that's because those crusades were ultimately successful. And so when battles end up producing long-term victories, you don't always hear about them quite like you do about a battle that was ultimately unsuccessful, like the Middle Eastern Crusades. So the Teutonic Knights go up to the north to fight along the Baltic Sea. All right, this brings us then to the Fourth Crusade. And the Fourth Crusade, there's actually one crusade that's even worse than the Fourth Crusade, but the Fourth Crusade is the absolute low point of the Crusades in 1204. So we are now 150 years or so from when the Crusades started in 1095. Not quite, 110 years, I guess. So here we are in 1204, and there is a group of European soldiers that's ready to go down and to fight against the infidels. It was initiated by Pope Innocent III. He's the same pope who orchestrated the Fourth Lateran Council, which is something that's important, and we'll talk about more later. But the Fourth Crusade was intended to have European soldiers go across the Mediterranean Sea, take ships down to Egypt, and then from Egypt to attack Jerusalem from the south. So the idea was they won't see us coming if we attack them from the south, because they're going to expect an attack from the north, because all of the other crusades have been attacks from the north. So the Muslims had certainly built up defenses, and we could bypass all of those defenses if we go down to the south into Egypt and then up to Jerusalem from the southeast. The problem was the Crusaders didn't have any money to pay the ships to take them down to Egypt to fight against the infidels. So they needed money. Alexius Angelus offers the Crusaders the money they need to pay for the ships to go down to Egypt to fight Jerusalem if they will come and help him put down the civil unrest that exists in the city of Constantinople. So we have the Emperor of the East asking these Western soldiers who are waiting to go attack Muslims, asking them to come to Constantinople to help him stay in power. The Crusaders then say, yeah, that's great. We will come help you restore power to Constantinople if you give us the money we need to go get on the ships to go fight the battle we originally intended to fight. The Crusaders expect to be welcomed when they get to the city. Instead, they are resisted and scorned by the city's inhabitants. And while they are waiting outside the city, the usurper, the one who had challenged Alexius and Angelus's authority, the usurper mismanages his own troops, and so the Crusaders are able to restore Alexius and Angelus to power. And in response for all of that, in return for all of that, they're supposed to get the money they need to go down and fight the crusade. The problem is Isaac II, Alexius and Angelus, they don't have the money to pay the Crusaders what it was that they promised them. So Constantinople at this time was in financial and political turmoil. Alexius IV was not able to immediately pay the Crusaders what he had promised them, so he asked them to help him for another 6 months while he acquired the necessary funds. So in other words, everything goes as planned except for the fact that the Emperor of Constantinople doesn't have the money that he promised to the guys who came to help him. Well, during this time, the restored Emperor Alexius becomes increasingly unpopular with the inhabitants of Constantinople because they don't like the fact that he acquired the help of these Western Crusaders. And as a result of this, Alexius IV is murdered by a usurper named Murtzophlus, and Murtzophlus takes the name Alexius V. Murtzophlus, this usurper, refuses to pay the Crusaders anything at all, because part of the reason that he was able to gain power was because of the open hostility of the inhabitants of Byzantium towards the Crusaders in the first place. In retaliation, the Crusaders siege the city and eventually conquer the city of Constantinople. On April 12th, 1204, the Crusaders took the city, destroyed great portions of it, and this marked then the final split between the East and the West. So here's a Greek author, Spiros Varanis, who you can imagine, because he's Greek, he's writing from the perspective of the Eastern Kingdom. Here's how he describes what happened in the Fourth Crusade. The Latin, or the Western, soldiers subjected the greatest city in Europe to an indescribable sack. For 3 days they murdered, raped, looted, and destroyed on a scale which even the ancient Vandals and Goths would have found unbelievable. Constantinople had become a veritable museum of ancient and Byzantine art, an emporium of such incredible wealth that the Latins were astounded at the riches they found. Though the Venetians had an appreciation for the art which they discovered and saved much of it, and in fact, if you go to Venice today, you'll see large collections of Byzantine art that is there. It was taken during the Fourth Crusade. The French and others destroyed indiscriminately, halting to refresh themselves with wine, the violation of nuns, and the murder of Orthodox clerics. The Crusaders vented their hatred for the Greeks most spectacularly in the desecration of the greatest church in Christendom. They smashed the silver iconostasis, the icons, and the holy books of the Hagia Sophia, which is the name of that church there. Seated upon the patriarchal throne, a whore who sang coarse songs as they drank wine from the church's holy vessels. The estrangement, or the separation between East and West, which had proceeded over the centuries, culminated in the horrible massacre that accompanied the conquest of Constantinople. The Greeks were convinced that even the Turks, had they taken the city, would not have been as cruel as the Western Christians. The defeat of Byzantium, already in a state of decline, accelerated political degeneration so that the Byzantines eventually became easy prey to the Turks. The crusading movement thus resulted ultimately in the victory of Islam, a result which was, of course, the exact opposite of its original intention. So the Crusades in 1095 start as a way to protect the Eastern Church. And 110 years later, in 1204, they become the very means for the destruction of the eastern half of Roman Christianity. So the Fourth Crusade is the low point because Christian soldiers from the West, who were supposed to go down and fight the Crusades in the Middle East, end up on the doorsteps of Byzantium fighting the Christians of the East and eventually destroying their city.
So that region was Greek owned or controlled at that point? Because now, I mean, look at it nowadays, it's a flip-flop. Turkey's the one that's oversized and Greek is small, Armenia is small.
Yeah, modern day Greece is sort of the, I suppose from a standpoint of heritage, modern day Greece is sort of the remnant of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Yeah, they spoke Greek and everything else. I mean, at one point, all of modern day Turkey was part of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But eventually Turkey comes to represent the Muslim advance against the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Turks eventually conquer Constantinople. It'll be 150 more years before they're able to do it, but in 1453 they conquer the eastern capital city. All right, one more crusade just to mention before I let you guys go, and I know we need to go here pretty soon, but one more crusade just to talk about how bad things got during this time period. Because on Tuesday, when we get back from Thanksgiving break, we're not going to talk about the Crusades anymore, was what is called the Children's Crusade. So this is just a few years after the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Most historians believe that this actually took place at least to some degree, though it's a little bit unclear about how much legend might be surrounding some of this. But much like the Peasants Crusade that was part of the First Crusade, the Children's Crusade was tens of thousands, certainly thousands of probably teenage kids, children, who felt the call of crusade and were compelled to go and fight for the Holy Land. Now, they didn't have any weapons, but they thought that they would just march down towards the Holy Land, and when they got there, they weren't exactly sure what was going to happen, but they thought something miraculous would happen. Well, they marched as far south as Marseille. When they got to Marseille, they hit the Mediterranean Sea, and they had to stop because there's a big body of water between them and where they wanted to go. And they waited because they believed that in the same way that God parted the ocean for Moses, that he would perhaps part the Mediterranean for them. That didn't happen. And so we had many of them who returned home disillusioned. But according to at least one account, there were 7 ships that picked up many of these children and took them under the promise of delivering them to their destination in modern-day Israel, took them out to sea. These 7 ships then met up with Muslim Arab ships, and the children were then transferred as slaves onto the Arab vessels. So a lot of this kind of stuff going on. Some of the ships also sank, according to that same account. So it didn't end well for the Children's Crusade. But it just gives you a kind of an insight into how bizarre some of these things were. The Fourth Crusade, fighting other Christians. The Children's Crusade, we're sending teenagers to go do this. It gives us a little bit of an insight into the mentality that was sweeping through Europe during this period of time. The Crusades, from a big picture perspective, I think are a blight on the history of Christianity. And yet I think a good reminder for us of the negative ramifications that can come when we start to confuse the kingdom of Christ with the kingdom of this world. And that's where it all started. And certainly we would never advocate crusade today, but I think there are some Christians even in America who sometimes get confused about whether or not the kingdom they're living for is the kingdom of Christ or a kingdom in this world. So political involvement and all those other kinds of things are lessons that I think we can take from this.